I don't think. But I guess 80 years ago they were worse because they've been processed to get rid of that amygdalin. And you can go on and on and on. Foods have been deliberately made devoid of amygdalin. And as long as we continue to eat those foods, we're setting ourselves up for a real bad experience when the body starts to heal itself and then needs to stop healing itself. Now, that is kind of a quick overview of the intrinsic and the extrinsic factor. We could talk more about it, but I think that gives you a general idea of the science of cancer therapy. The truth of the matter is, the science of cancer therapy is not nearly as complicated as the politics of cancer therapy. Because that's where it gets really nasty. That is the part of the story that I was completely unprepared for when I asked the question, who are they, John? And at first I couldn't believe it. This story led me, of all places, to Nazi Germany. I'll be talking about that in a little while. The reason for that is because pre-Nazi Germany, actually, was the origin of some of the world's greatest cartels in the pharmaceutical and chemical industries. And they came to the United States and they formed strategic partnerships with major pharmaceutical companies and other companies in the United States. And these cartels became a tremendously powerful and influential economic force in the field of medicine. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. The first thing that comes to mind when people hear the science of cancer is this. They say, well, if this is true, if what you say is true and it's that simple, how come my doctor doesn't know about it? I mean, he went to medical school. He's a very smart guy. And I've known his family for years. He's a wonderful, principled person. He wouldn't deliberately hold back a control for cancer, and indeed he's not. So the question is, how come your doctor doesn't know about this? Or worse, how come your doctor tells you to run for your life, stay away from this because it's quackery, and he thinks he's doing you a favor by telling you that? Why is this? How did this come about? Now, in order to answer that question, we have to get a little background. In my book, World Without Cancer, I've documented, in fact, the whole major portion of the last half of the book is devoted to a documentation of the connection between the Rockefeller financial institutions and this cartel that I mentioned a moment ago called IG Farben. IG, I think, stands for Interessengemeinschaft or something like that. My German is non-existent, but it stands, I've been told, for a community of interest. It's translated into community of interest, Farben. Another way of saying community of interest would be cartel. That would be our word for it. So it's the Farben cartel that we're talking about. And Farben, it was the word that derived from the old, the beginning of the whole chemical industry, which was dyestuffs. It all began with the creation of dyes. And from there it went into industrial chemicals, and from there it went into pharmaceuticals. And that's, of course, where it is today, to say nothing of munitions, which was sort of an offshoot of the whole thing. So you're talking about a tremendously large and financially powerful cartel that originated in Germany, but very quickly partnered with the Rockefeller Group in this country. I wish we had time to talk more about that, but they did form a very close partnership, even to the point where they themselves described it as a marriage. And they used the word very consciously. It was a marriage between Rockefeller and IG Farben. Rockefeller has become very influential in the pharmaceutical industry, first in the United States and now around the world, but has chosen to remain pretty much behind the scenes. They know that it wouldn't look good to have the Rockefeller name popping up under all branches of industry. It's bad enough, they feel, that they're so well identified with the oil industry. How much worse it would be if they were also identified as being a dominant factor in the pharmaceutical industry. And so they consciously made the choice years ago to operate primarily behind street names and Swiss accounts and that kind of thing. But the influence can be shown, it can be proven, and it's very, very, very powerful. Now, you just have to sort of take my word for it at this point without looking at the documentation in the book. But you'll see traces of this coming up in the story I'm about to tell you. Let's pick up the story and see how these interests captured control of the American medical establishment. The mechanism that they used to do this was brilliant. They used the tax-exempt foundations. Most of the great tax-exempt foundations, of this country at least, were created by the same financial interests which have a powerful influence in the pharmaceutical industry. We're talking about the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, and people like that. And what they did is they used the tax-exempt foundation, some of which they created themselves, and some of which they took over, which is not too difficult to do if you have a lot of money. And the tactic, as I mentioned, was pioneered by Rockefeller and Carnegie. The reason they used the tax-exempt foundations was there were three primary reasons. One was to improve their public image. At the time that this was all happening, there was kind of a public distaste for these tycoons. I mean, they were viewed as being ruthless. They had too much money for their own good. They were viewed as cruel and nasty people, and there was a lot of envy. And so they called together their public relations people and said, we got to deal with this. So they started a campaign to do philanthropy. They figured if you can give away money for public causes, and these causes are viewed as good, why then people will like you. And so they hired newspaper people and foundation people, and they planted a lot of stories, made sure the American public was well aware. Every time they donated a grant to a hospital or to a library or something like that, got a lot of publicity, got their name across the top of the door. And then they developed a particular style which was advanced by a fellow by the name of Gates, who went to work for Carnegie. Previously, he had worked for Pillsbury, and he developed what was jokingly called the Pillsbury formula for making bread. Well, it was not the kind of bread that Pillsbury made. It was the kind of bread that you spend, you know. At least that's what we used to call it in school. That was bread. You got any bread, man? You know. It was that kind of a bread. And the formula was this. For Pillsbury, who had a particularly bad reputation in the community, this fellow Gates said, look, Mr. Pillsbury, let's go into the community and we'll do something called matching funds. You will put up $1 for every dollar that can be raised by the citizens themselves in the community for this hospital or for this library. He said, now the advantage of that is you get a lot of people working with you, and they view themselves as on your team. And so they're out there raising money, and they're mentioning your name. Every time they raise a buck, they're mentioning your name, and they become your publicity agents in a way. And they have an affinity to you because now they're working with you. And so you have all of these people working for free for you, raising money, and you only put up half the money that you would have ordinarily. So this way you still get your name across the top of the door of the library, but it's only cost you half as much money, and you got all this good publicity besides. That was the Pillsbury formula. Rockefeller saw that, and he hired Gates immediately. He says, you got to come to work for me, and he did. So this fellow Gates was largely the genius behind so much of this strategy. And it's what they called efficiency.